Awesome. 307 is open for 307. Okay. Elections Committee will come to order. Just want to note that we have 307. Room 307 is open for overflow if anyone's not able to fit in this room. Would the clerk please take the attendance?
Chair Cernalou?
Here.
Representatives Wagella?
Here.
Pope?
Here.
Colazar?
Here.
Burns?
Here.
Churches?
Present.
Smith?
Present.
DeBoyer?
Here.
Madam Chair, you have 8 members present. You do have a quorum.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Representative DeBoyer makes a motion to adopt the minutes from the November 12, 2024 meeting. Without objections, the minutes are adopted. Today we are going to hear Senate Bills 401 through 404, also known as the Michigan Voting Rights Act. We have a large number of people that have indicated they would like to speak on these bills. So just as a reminder for anyone that wishes to testify today, please submit a card and mark that you wish to speak. And we will do our best to accommodate you, but we may not have time for everyone to speak. We're going to start off today's committee with testimony from Senator Darren Camilleri, who is the sponsor of Senate Bill 401. Senator Camilleri intends to speak to the entire package. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, members of the committee. Really appreciate it. My colleagues, Senator Moss, Senator Chang, Senator Geis, were unable to attend this morning. We are in session in the Senate, so we're just bouncing between obligations, but it's my honor to be here to testify on behalf of Senate Bills 401 through 404, collectively known as the Michigan Voting Rights Act. These are the culmination of more than 18 months of drafting, refining policy, meeting with varied stakeholders to find compromise on a historic piece of legislation that will safeguard every Michigander's right to vote for decades to come. Our country, and in many ways our state, now stand at a turning point. We don't exactly know what the future will hold, but what's certain is that in the results of the last election, we have moved our country and our relationship with politics and institutional norms into uncharted waters. Before the election, I viewed the MVRA as a necessary step forward, a checkbox that should be ticked off as we seek to codify the essential rights and liberties of every Michigander. In the aftermath of November 5th, I now see these bills as essential. Michigan's election system is unique in that it is administered by 1,699 county and local election officials, making it the most decentralized election system in the nation. The distributed nature of Michigan's election system has many advantages, but one disadvantage is that it provides opportunities for bad actors to exploit or deceive otherwise well-meaning election officials, or worse, seek to infiltrate and influence election administrator positions for the benefit of one particular political viewpoint. As Michigan cements its role as a key swing state and electoral battleground going forward, anti-democratic elements will no doubt continue to focus their attention here on our beloved state. Our job as policymakers, and frankly as Americans, is to ensure that our elections are free, fair, and accessible to everyone, that undue advantages and disadvantages are prohibited, and that the outcome of our elections remain decided by voters on an equal playing field. The Michigan Voting Rights Act will accomplish these goals by providing pathways for voters of color and protected classes to safeguard their vote and their right to fair political representation. It will ban voter intimidation and voter suppression. It will securely aggregate data so that decision makers and the court system can make decisions that are supported by rigorous evidence. It will expand language translation for communities who need it, and it will empower disabled voters with additional ways to exercise their vote in person. Democracy is a fragile thing, and while I will always respect the will of the voters, I am less confident than I've ever been that the federal government or the Supreme Court will protect our voting rights. We've seen them erode them time and time again from the federal Supreme Court. This is now our job. The bills I'm offering are insurance policy for voting rights for Michiganders. A policy that takes core concepts and mechanisms of the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965 and builds upon them so that they are more efficient, more applicable, and more targeted to the particularities of our state. Whether you're an independent, a Republican, a Democrat, these bills are good for you. They aim to protect your vote and your voice no matter who you support. I want to take a moment to thank my colleagues who've worked really, really hard on this. Senator Moss, Senator Chang, Senator Geis, as well as Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson and her staff, all the voting rights advocates and their staff, civil rights organizations and municipal clerks who spent countless hours working to get us to this point. We would not be here today without all of you and your commitment to this cause. I also want to have a special thank you for our Senate staff, including in my office and on our policy team. They put in countless hours to make this bill package possible. There are many experts here to testify, so I urge you to listen carefully to their arguments, but know this: by passing these bills, Michigan will become a leader in protecting voting rights at the state level. This is a crucial moment, and we cannot let this opportunity pass us by. I urge your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Camilleri. I'm sure we are going to have a lot of questions regarding the details of each bill, but I know that you have some time constraints. Who would you direct us to ask those specific questions? Because I want to be respectful of your time.
Absolutely. So there's a series of people who will be coming up behind me. I know Secretary of State Benson is coming up to speak, as well as folks from LDF, Promote the Vote, as well as any of the experts who are here today. I think that they are broken up into different sections. So if you have language access questions, there will be some language access folks talking about that. If you've got questions on the legal process, LDF will be here to answer some of those questions. I mean, I'm happy to take one or two if there are any broader questions if you'd like.
So for maybe 401, LDF might be, and then the language access you just mentioned. What about cost questions? Would they also address those, or would we want to address those?
I think that there will be some folks who can answer the cost question. Like all of our election administration, costs are always a part of the equation. The subs that you adopted, I know that there have been some questions around language translation costs. We clarified the intent of the language in the sub on some of the in-person translation costs. That there may have been a memo that has been out there. That memo is not accurate in terms of what the cost will be. We've clarified that this will be for the jurisdictions where this applies. It is an option that they can use in person or a virtual system. So if that question is still out there, trust me, the high price of translating ballots and translating in-person instructions is not going to be the case.
Thank you, Senator. Does anyone specifically have questions for the senator, or I'll hold my questions for some of the others testifying. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Next up, we will have testimony from Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who is also planning to speak to all of the bills in the package. Welcome, Secretary Benson.
Thank you, Chair Cernoglu, and Majority Vice Chair Wagala, and Minority Vice Chair Schmidt. It's wonderful to see you all here today, and all of my friends on this committee. Thank you for holding this important hearing. I'm here as well with my Deputy Secretary of State, Agogo Adeviye, who, as you know, has been one of the driving advocates and forces behind the Michigan Voting Rights Act. So I asked him to join me as well so that we can answer any questions that you have. I think we're both here on behalf of the people of Michigan to urge you to enact the Voting Rights Act for the state of Michigan. And you might be wondering why the Voting Rights Act is needed in our state. I can understand that. We have really seen our democracy transform in very significant pro-voter ways over the last several years, and we've just seen the highest turnout election in Michigan's history. 5.7 million citizens voted in last month's general election, and over 820,000 of those voters were first-time voters, close to 1 million. And so that's great for our democracy, especially because it's now become a pattern of high turnout elections in our state. The midterm elections in 2022 were the highest midterm elections in our state's history, highest turnout midterm elections in our state's history, and of course, the second highest turnout election in our state's history was in 2020. So we have turned a corner, and we're seeing more citizens, more individuals, more Michiganders participate in their democracy than ever before, in no small part due to a lot of work that voters themselves have pushed forward in the state through working with organizations like Promote the Vote and others that are here today. So we're very proud of the fact that while in 2018, when I took office, our election system was ranked 32nd throughout the country, we're now ranked number 2 behind one state, New Mexico, which, by the way, also recently passed a Voting Rights Act for their state. I also want to mention that in 2024, I would be remiss to not recognize the extraordinary work that our clerks all around the state did to, among other things, effectively implement the in-person early voting right that every resident in the state of Michigan, every citizen in the state of Michigan has. Throughout October this year, we saw Michiganders take advantage of these early voting opportunities all throughout our state. And thanks in part to this committee's partnership and investment in that option, our 1,520 local clerks and 83 county clerks were able to work together and ensure that every Michigander could access their right to vote prior to Election Day, and ultimately over half the electorate did so. More than 3 million Michiganders cast their ballots prior to November 5th this year, and over 1 million of those chose to do so at an early voting location in person. So there's a lot to be proud of in our state when it comes to the strides we've made to increase the accessibility and security of our democracy in recent years. And more than our work or your work, it's really the voters' work that has made all of this possible, with their overwhelming bipartisan endorsement of the constitutional amendments that led the way to enshrining and expanding the ease of access to the ballot box in this state. And that's ultimately why I'm here today, because in those constitutional amendments is a guaranteed right to vote for our citizens. And just like there's a guarantee for early voting and a guarantee for election day registration or voter registration and a guarantee to be able to vote from home, there's also a guarantee to have a substantive right to vote in our state. And so what the Michigan Voting Rights Act really is about is making sure that constitutional right is real, just in the way that you've passed legislation to make those other constitutional rights I've just mentioned real for our citizens. This is, in my view, the additional piece that needs to happen, the additional legislation that is needed to make those constitutional rights real for our residents. And, in every one of our last 3 elections, our clerks have stepped up to meet the moment and deliver smooth, secure election administration despite unprecedented challenges. And what we've learned along the way as we've achieved these great successes is that even with all this success, these challenges, these threats that we've had to overcome, whether it's misinformation, whether it's deterrence from voting, or whether it's more explicit suppression tactics or confusion about rights to vote that we've seen percolate throughout our state and throughout our country, really remind us that these threats to our progress in our democracy remain. And, we need to look no further than the consistent weakening of the federal Voting Rights Act protections over the last several decades and the impact that has had in other states nationwide, to realize that it is up to every individual state in this moment to step up and ensure that the basic right to freely elect our representatives and hold them accountable remains intact for every citizen in our country and in our state. Now, as I mentioned, in addition to New Mexico, other states have already stepped up, like California in 2002, the state of Washington, the state of Oregon, Virginia, New York, Connecticut, and most recently, Minnesota earlier this year. All of those states have passed Voting Rights Acts to make sure that we are meeting the moment to make our democracy real for all of our residents. Our state Senate, as you know, has already enacted this legislation, and now it's your turn. So I'm here today to, again, urge you to take this step forward to help be a part of, as you have been all along, expanding and protecting access to democracy in our state. We know this law, this Voting Rights Act, would further make it real, this explicit right to vote enshrined in our state constitution, specifically by prohibiting voter denial, dilution, or suppression, expanding the number of jurisdictions that must translate election-related information, and enhancing and clarifying protections for voters with disabilities or others who need assistance to participate in our elections. We've made a lot of important advances in Michigan over the last few years, but it was only 3 years ago that nearly 40 laws were proposed in this very legislature that would have made voting more confusing and challenging in our state. That potential for us to move backwards is always there. What this law would do is help protect against those types of tactics and also remind us that our work to maintain and protect all voters' access to the ballot box is not a struggle of the past. It's a living and constant responsibility that we all have every day, especially in these positions. So to honor those who've come before us and the great successes we've seen as we've strengthened our democracy in this state, I hope you'll join us in standing up for democracy, supporting the Michigan Voting Rights Act so that we can continue to ensure Michigan is leading the nation in a free and accessible democracy for all. Thanks.
Thank you, Secretary Benson. Does anyone have any questions specifically for Secretary Benson? I think we are going to take a deeper dive into the details on the bills as we go forward. And I know you probably also have some time constraints, so I'm going to hold my questions as well until later. But it looks like we do have a question from Representative Smith.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary Benson, for being here today. I'm just curious, what are some specific voter suppression tactics that were used in this most recent election?
Well, we've certainly saw accounts that were widely covered in the public of people showing up to the polls to potentially threaten or intimidate people from participating in elections. Those, due to our field team, were quickly addressed so that they didn't metastasize. We oftentimes see people getting aggressive, even if it's just to support their particular candidates outside of certain areas, and that can be an issue as well. The advancements of AI as well have created the potential for opportunities for people to mislead people about where to vote or where their precinct is, and so we need protections against those pieces as well.
Okay, if I just may follow up, there, as you mentioned, there was a plethora of bills that we just passed, and many of those were for voter intimidation and such. So I understand. I mean, we have the National Voting Rights Act, and this just seems to go so much further beyond that. So I'm just curious why that wouldn't be sufficient.
Oh, well, it's very interesting. I'm glad you brought that up. The National Voting Rights Act has been significantly weakened since its passage in 1965 by a series of decisions, ongoing decisions at the federal court level. And that's exactly why so many states have stepped up to fill the gap and to ensure we have a state voting rights act that essentially fulfills the promise of the Federal Voting Rights Act that was enacted in 1965 to ensure that the promise of one person, one vote is real for everyone. And so in the weakening of the federal protections, which I know a lot of my colleagues from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and others will be talking about today, has really called for the need for states to step up. And that's precisely why you're seeing states around the country, as I mentioned, pass state voting rights acts.
Okay. Can I have one more quick follow-up?
Yes.
I think it was 8 states that passed it. Is that right? Do you know of those states how many are conducted at the local level, like we have at Michigan?
Yeah, where our system is decentralized, but many other states are as well. Minnesota, Connecticut. Obviously, every state is different. But even in California, which has significantly larger jurisdictions, including the county of Los Angeles, which has millions of voters, and in some ways as large as many small states, you have that decentralized system of voting as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Benson and Deputy Secretary Agogo Devi. We will let you, unless you have anything further for us, we will let you go.
Deputy Secretary Agogo Devier will be around as well to answer any additional questions that come up. I mean, we've been working with you all for the better part of, I think, over a year on a lot of these things, and have continued to be present and available for any questions you have as you proceed on these important deliberations. So we'll continue to be available for whatever you need.
Thank you so much for all your work and your testimony today. Now we are going to turn to Mary Clark and Chris Swope, representing the Michigan Association of Municipal Clerks. And also, just want to note, I think we are going to hear some more specific concerns from the clerks at this time, and I think this probably is a good time for it, because then we'll continue to have the conversation throughout the hearing, and maybe be able to answer any questions that come up. And as I've noted personally to both of you, we are looking forward to continuing to work with you on any concerns that you might have now that the bill package has moved into the House.
Yes,
so welcome. And
Thank you, Representative Cernoglu, for having us here today and for calling us up to speak. If you had told me a year ago that I would ever testify in opposition to anything called a voting rights bill, I would have laughed in your face. So it's a little bit sad to me that that we are in this position, and there are some things that could be addressed in this bill that could bring the clerks on board. We support voting rights, and I want there to be a Michigan Voting Rights Act. There are just a few details in this package that concern us, primarily costs to our communities, as well as I think you could end up with situations where communities are almost presumed guilty when it may not be anything that is occurring within the community, and any lawsuit or action brought based on this Voting Rights Act, I think will taint a community's name. So, those are kind of some overarching concerns. One of the things, some specific issues that we have is that, again, it kind of does presume that the local government is guilty, and we will have to disprove that. And there are specific things in the bill that prohibit all factors from being considered in terms of our defense. The polarized voting, the court is not allowed to consider the reason behind polarized voting, which could be partisan reasons. For example, you could have a township that is predominantly one political party and the minority group is of a different political party. And yes, they're going to be voting differently than the bulk of the residents of that community, simply because, most of our townships are Republican leaning in the state of Michigan, and minorities tend to be Democratic leaning, so you've already got that built in. The big concern is it doesn't seem to limit the remedies to, and I'm speaking specifically of 401 right now, it doesn't seem to limit the remedies to things that would actually cure or address the problem. So you could end up with a voting system in a township that doesn't change the situation of who gets elected, simply because there's a majority of one party or another. We're also fairly concerned that the bill would allow remedies that are not allowed under state law. And one example of that is we have half a dozen or more communities in Michigan that have amended their charters to adopt ranked choice voting. And yet the Michigan election law does not allow ranked choice voting. And so these communities are simply waiting for state law to address it. And yet under this bill, a court could order ranked choice voting as a remedy, because the court is allowed to give remedies that are not allowed in state law. Another example is every township in Michigan, there is no ability under law to have any type of districts. Every township, the township board and all of the elected officials are elected township-wide, at large. This bill would allow a court to create districts for township trustees. So, we're concerned that it's allowing remedies that some communities would like to try right now but can't, and we feel like that's a little bit backwards. And then you could end up with a situation where a community that wanted to do ranked choice voting then gets sued, and then the court orders ranked choice voting, and yet the community is looked upon as having violated the voting rights of their constituents when it's something that they were already trying to do and weren't allowed by state law.
So I want to put in a perspective. Chris and I have been before many of you for years testifying on behalf of the Municipal Clerks Association. We now have over 1,000 members. So it is our responsibility as leadership to speak on behalf of all of our members, not just a few. And with that, we are very, very concerned about the fact there's no court of law that happens where the accused, the presumed guilty, however you want to define them, does not have an opportunity to speak in their defense. This does not allow for municipalities to present any evidence as to why or what we perceive is happening in a jurisdiction. And that is the core of what we are opposing in this bill. We have come so far in working this. And to Senator Camilleri and Senator Moss's credit, they have spent hours with us. I mean, we will not deny that we have had a seat at the table and we have come very, very far in this bill. But this is an issue that our members are very, very serious about. And it is a big issue. So we hope that we can get past that in 401 to where we can get to a point that we are neutral. You're not going to find a more dedicated 1,000 plus 1,500 clerks in the state of Michigan that are committed to their voters and their communities. And that's our job, is to be their voice. So thank you.
And on Senate Bill 403, our biggest concern with the language bill is the lower threshold in 2030. There had been some discussions about changing it to require it on a precinct basis, but that is not in this bill, and we just feel that those thresholds impact too many communities across the state. We are also concerned with the cost, and it's unclear what all materials would have to be translated. We have so many things. We have ballot marking instructions that are specific in state law. We have language that's on the secrecy sleeve for an absentee ballot required. We
Signs.
have posters that things that we have to post in polling places. And it's a little unclear how that could be administered, especially with mail-in ballots. With vote by mail, it just seems like a little bit of a Pandora's box. And I think if we start with the higher threshold and then have some experience, we may figure out a threshold for the future. But having it adopted at this time, I think is a mistake.
And we're very concerned. We want it clear in law that local jurisdictions are not going to be held responsible for these costs, because we have communities that absolutely cannot afford thousands of dollars of cost. And I'll give you an example. A little community like Coldwater, under the current draft of who would be immediately impacted, would have to have three languages. And if you know where Coldwater is, it's down near the state line, and it's a small community. They have to have 3. And we're not objecting to the 3. We just want affirmation in law that we are not going to be held accountable for those costs. It's not an issue of doing it. It's an issue of how does it get paid for.
So just want to clarify to make sure I'm understanding correctly. So cost is certainly a concern. And then beyond that, you are supportive of expanding language access, but just not beneath a certain threshold.
Right. The
Correct.
100
Okay.
threshold is the deal breaker for us.
Okay.
100 voters in a community is not very many voters. We'd like a little more experience, and again, the reassurance in law, not word, because we all know that someone's word is as good as they're in that chair, and then that word goes with them when their term is up and they're someplace else. We want a solid affirmation that we are not going to be held liable for the costs.
Do you have anything further on?
Well, we're neutral on 402 and 404.
Okay, thank you. we are going to open up for questions now. Looks like we have some questions from Representative Burns.
Thank you, Chair Cernoglu. Thank you both for being here today and for testifying. I wanted to circle back to something that you mentioned earlier. I believe it was in reference to Senate Bill 401, but please correct me if I'm referring to the wrong bill. You spoke to your concern about the possibility of a situation where a municipality might be deemed to be in violation of the Voting Rights Act if it were to pass and become law. So if a municipality were deemed to be in violation, they were taken to court, I think you mentioned a concern that a clerk or a municipality would not be able to defend themselves or perhaps enter evidence or kind of speak on their own behalf. So I wanted to make sure first that I am referring to the right bill so that I know where to look. So it is
Yes, you
401.
are.
Thank you. And then can you just elaborate on that a little bit more, how that's included in the bill and what that looks like?
It's page.
I was surprised to hear that, so I just wanted a little more.
Page
info.
9,
Okay.
line 10 and through 16.
Okay.
So, evidence concerning the causes of, I'm on page 9, line 9.
Okay.
10. Evidence concerning the cause of or the reasons for the occurrence of racially polarized voting is not relevant to the determination of whether racially polarized voting occurs. We want to be able to exacerbate on that, to explain, to give information about our, just for example, I'm a township clerk.
Okay.
And as Chris testified, it doesn't matter, all of our seats are, all our 4 trustees are at large. All of the 7 positions in a charter township are at large. And I live in, I'm the clerk in Delta Township. We don't have neighborhoods of racial concentrations. We're very diverse in our township, but not everyone looks like us. And that's why we have to look for what does everybody look like. There are townships that have areas where there are populations culturally that cluster together for their cultural or ethnic reasons. So they're without a ward system that is not allowed by law, they would not be able to do anything, but I can't present that. I can't talk about that if there's a allegation brought forward. We're just asking for the ability to have conversation at the table. As I said, there's no court that I'm aware of where, in the United States, where someone is not allowed to speak in their own defense or explanation. That's our concerns.
Okay.
If you read page 9, you'll get
Okay, page 9. I appreciate you sharing that. I'll dig into that a little bit more. When you mentioned that, as you just referenced, it seems odd that you wouldn't be able to enter any evidence or speak on something like that. So I'll dig into that a little bit more.
It doesn't change. It doesn't mean that we're going to win a case. If we're wrong, we're wrong. And we understand that and we accept that. We want the opportunity to have a voice in the entire discussion.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. We're going to go to Representative DeBoyer.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, guys. Thank you for what you do. Obviously, I realize personally what it is at times, and it's much appreciated.
You do.
Even at times that we may disagree on some things. I really do appreciate what you do. It's become a harder job, right? A couple of things that I've noticed here. The first thing is, and perhaps the Deputy Secretary would chime in on this, there was statements made about nefarious behavior of outside actors, right? Citizens pressing back and pushing back and causing problems. But these bills don't address citizens, right? They address you guys, right?
Correct.
They address the election administrators.
Correct.
But I heard a lot of leverage that was taken that said we have all these bad things going on by people pushing back, and we witnessed it in 2020, and we watched it again in 22. And in fact, Rep. Schmidt asked the question, and we witnessed some examples in 24. But those were all outside people. Those were not people who were in the administration election. So I would ask to you guys, Can you give me some examples of the internal behaviors and actions by clerks, by precinct chairs, by poll workers, by boards of, canvassers that may have warranted even this examination of internal behavior?
I haven't experienced anything. I think it's possible that people make a mistake, not an evil intent, but we're all human. I have conducted 5 elections in the past 12 months. My staff has had no time off. We each got 1 week. That's it. We went from one election to another, to another, to another. I'm not the only one in the state of Michigan. There were jurisdictions that had 6 elections in the past 12 months. The demands on someone creates tired people. My staff has mandatory overtime starting the end of September. They don't leave for lunch. We have lunch brought in. They don't leave at night until all of our ballots are either issued, if there was a request, or we have hundreds that come in that have to be scanned in, the signatures have to be verified, you have to balance. We don't go home until that's done, because tomorrow could be worse. Tomorrow's numbers could be bigger. It's a lot of work. So to say that an innocent mistake doesn't happen by someone in the state of Michigan, I can't say that, because it could happen. That doesn't make the clerk the enemy. That doesn't make the clerk the fault.
So,
Representative Boyer.
I can kind of shift this a little bit to other things that we do as election officials and as municipal bodies, including across the state, we're getting more and more resistance to having polling places in schools, which are, places in our communities, in our neighborhoods. So I've had to pull back from most of the school buildings. And whenever I pull back from a school building, there's a question of, am I reducing the access to someone? So that would be addressed by this bill, whether someone is impacted. And I'm a little bit concerned that it might. I don't think we use the word materially impaired in the bill, and that might be something to look at because every time you move something, someone's impaired. But is it, if I move a polling place 2 miles, is that material? Is it, obviously it's an impairment if it's 2 miles further, but for the people who I moved it closer to, it's not an impairment. So, I think the full breadth of what is covered by this is positive. We want to make sure we're not doing things to negatively impact people. And if you think about the history of this country and even of this state, there were, where there are wards in cities where they were drawn for specific reasons that were not for equality. So I think those are important values that we do want to have covered by a Voting Rights Act. So I think it is good to have this. I do support having a Voting Rights Act, as I said before. That's why we're trying to work on some of the details.
Representative Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you both for being here to testify and to be the voice for your over 1,000 members. I do appreciate that. Personally, with my own experience, and I just wanted more of a statement, just share. I share the same concerns of what you mentioned for all of what you stated earlier. And I did reach out to all of the clerks in my district that I represent, and there wasn't one clerk that was supportive of this. And they have a lot of concerns. And what I feel could be the effect of this is that we see a huge exodus of clerks. And that's a problem. That would be a very big problem for Michigan, and it would also cripple our local units of government. So thank you again for coming today and testifying and sharing that.
Thank you both. I assume you'll also be available for questions as we go forward, and hopefully we can address all of these things as we go forward. So thank you. Now we are going to have another clerk, Lisa Brown, who is the county clerk and register of deeds for Oakland County, joining us on Zoom. And apologize, but we're under a little bit of a time constraint, so if we can ask you to be somewhat brief, less than 5 minutes would be awesome. Welcome, Clerk Brown.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I will do my best. And I appreciate the opportunity to address you today. I guess a couple of quick things first. There was a question about which states are decentralized. I believe the answer I heard is not consistent with the knowledge that I have, so somebody might want to double check on that. I want to say I am concerned about the National Voting Rights Act being gutted at the federal level. Okay, I want to start with that. And so I appreciate the concern and a desire to make sure that we have those protections in the state of Michigan. However, this package of bills is not duplicative of the National Voting Rights Act. And I will try and focus with my allotted time more on Senate Bills 403 and 404. In the National Voting Rights Act, the threshold is 5% or 10,000. We can't do 10,000. That doesn't make sense for a decentralized state. But 5% is what is in the National Voting Rights Act. That's what we should be having in Michigan. No tiers, as Clerk Swope mentioned. There's nothing in here about if they have that data at the precinct level to go to a lower threshold. And the cost is a huge concern. And note that the Senate fiscal analysis included nothing when it came to Senate Bill 403. And it's been great that the Bureau, that the state has said, well, we'll take care of everything. We'll take care of everything. However, they can't, because no one has been able to answer my question as to who's going to do the audio recording for my voter assist terminal, because we do that here. So when we have a voter who is visually impaired and chooses to use our voter assist terminal with the audio component, putting on headphones to hear their choices, okay, someone's going to have to come and do that in every single language that's going to come into Oakland County. And it's a lot. We're a very diverse county. One of the many reasons why I love it here. There's that aspect of it. I understand, Arabic is not part of the NVRA, and so we want to include every language. But when we look at census data, for example, it says Chinese is the language. It doesn't say Mandarin. It doesn't say Cantonese. One of the other categories is Indo-European. If somebody wants to tell me what one language that is, that would be great. In Senate Bill 404, and talking about curbside voting, now it's been great that, the clerks appreciate the appreciation that has been put forth for the great job that we all did this past November and what we do for every single election. And I also want to add, I supported 18.3. I supported 22.2. I knew it was going to be more work for me, my staff, our local clerks, but I believe in ensuring that our voters have access to the ballot. But I cannot support these bills as they are. And I'm really disheartened by the fact that the Michigan Association of County Clerks put in cards for being neutral in the Senate with the caveat that more changes would come to these bills. And to now get pushback from some in the Senate to say, no, we're good. It really is disheartening. With curbside voting, so for those who don't know, I have run early voting for the majority of Oakland County, for over 900,000 voters. And we piloted it last November. I had other clerks come and watch so that they could see how we were running early voting. And I really tried to be a model for others and put myself out there so that others can learn from our experience as well. If there is a requirement to have curbside voting at early voting, I can tell you that it is most likely that I will not be running early voting in Oakland County any longer. The liability to the county is something that I cannot take on. The workers that we hire are become Oakland County employees because of how much they get paid. For the IRS purposes, they have to be county employees. If they are running up and down the stairs, running out to bring somebody a ballot, and they fall and break their leg, now I've got a workers' comp issue. Our early voting sites were not made to accommodate curbside voting. It was hard enough to find locations that we could utilize for 9 days, or really for 11 days at least, because a day for setup, a day to take it all down. Really hard to find multiple locations across the county. And it's worked really well. I know my local clerks have appreciated this partnership. It's going to be a huge burden on them if I can't do it and partner with them anymore. In addition, it is an unfunded mandate that we would now have to have 2 additional workers at every single site. So when we talk about the funding, and I have said I will sue for the unfunded mandate. In statute, it is required that there are 3 workers at every polling location. And now this is requiring 2 more, but not amending that. And if there is funding from the state, there's no guarantee that those 2 extra workers would be included. I do fear that these bills will have a chilling effect. I know someone just mentioned that. Clerks have taken on a lot, and we've done it. We've risen to the occasion. We've I think knocked it out of the ballpark. But I think this is it's too much, and it's not because it's too much work. It's that it's going too far in what we're trying to accomplish and how we ensure people have access to the ballot. I know there's a lot more I want to say, but I don't know if my 5 minutes.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I do have to wrap up. But we have a couple questions here, so we want to give the opportunity for that. Also, I have just a clarifying question. The County Clerks Association, are they neutral at this time? Are you aware?
So we have not taken a vote on the bills as is. The last vote that the Legislative Committee took was when they were in the Senate. Okay. And it was a vote of neutral with the caveat that there would be more changes to the bills that we were looking for.
Thank you. I think we do have a question from Representative. No, okay. Great. So thank you, thank you, Clerk Brown. And I assume you'll be available for questions if committee members want to contact you as well. So thank you for participating. Now we are going to go to testimony from Erica Perisman from Promote the Vote and Marissa Kovach from the ACLU. If you both want to join us together and provide testimony, we welcome your input.
Good morning. My name is Marissa Kovach. I am the political director at the ACLU of Michigan. I've submitted written testimony, so in the interest of time, I will try to keep it very brief. I've also submitted a policy paper that was co-released with the Legal Defense Fund that contextualizes the need for the Michigan Voting Rights Act. It covers a history of voting in Michigan, including a history of racial disparities as it pertains to access to the ballot and electoral representation, past Voting Rights Act challenges and other barriers voters in Michigan face to accessing the vote, which is backed up with data. And the ACLU has a long, over 100-year history of fighting to protect the rights and freedoms of people throughout our country. And this includes voting, which is the cornerstone of our democracy and the fundamental right upon which all of our civil liberties rests. So very excited today to come before you and support the Michigan Voting Rights Act. And we co-sign all of the comments that have been given previously by the bill sponsor, Secretary of State, and our partners that are coming following myself, including Promote the Vote. So the Michigan Voting Rights Act would provide Michigan with a strong, comprehensive protection for the right to vote. It will reinforce Michigan's recent progress to becoming a national leader on voting rights and inclusive democracy. And this passage of these bills is going to be is more important than ever, given the Federal Voting Rights Act has recently come under assault, as shared by Secretary Benson earlier. So for nearly 50 years, the Federal Voting Rights Act protected millions of voters of color from racial discrimination in voting, including protections to ensure states or localities with a troubled past could not find new ways to discriminate, and this does include some jurisdictions in Michigan. However, in 2013, the Shelby County case, the United States Supreme Court rendered those protections mostly inoperable, and it's now largely unable to protect voters. The Shelby County case decision also unleashed a wave of voter suppression in states at levels unseen since Jim Crow, and the decision allowed state and local governments to roll out discriminatory voter suppression schemes virtually unchecked. Now, we've been very fortunate in Michigan that we haven't succumbed to these attacks, but we have faced them in very recent history and are not immune from future attacks. So it's very important that while we can, we take this opportunity to give voters this critical layer of protection. And despite the Federal Voting Rights Act being one of the most successful civil rights laws in U.S. history, it doesn't fully address the need for voting rights protections in Michigan, especially in its current weakened form. And also because there are unique discriminatory barriers to equal protection for Michigan voters of color, disabled voters, and people whose first language is not English, where state-specific VRA can make really great progress. So finally, although the Federal Voting Rights Act has been effective at combating barriers federal courts have been chipped away at, and other legal protections in recent years have made it increasingly complex and burdensome for voters to fight for their rights in court. So these bills will truly help equip voters with the tools that they need to advocate for themselves and their rights in court. So thank you. I think pass it on to my friend and colleague.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Cerniglu and members of the committee for having me here to testify this morning. My name is Erica Parisman, and I'm a senior advisor at Promote the Vote. As Secretary Benson mentioned, we have really made a tremendous amount of progress in the state of Michigan over the past 6 years. We've, thanks to the voters and to this legislature, we have leapfrogged really from being kind of at the back of the pack among the states to being near the top. But really, there are still a lot of barriers that exist, particularly, as Marissa said, for voters of color, disabled voters, and voters with limited English proficiency. And that's what these bills are meant to address, those gaps in the system, the barriers that still exist for those particular communities. And it's only when those citizens, all citizens, can meaningfully participate in our political process that we'll be able to say that our voting system works for everyone. So what do these bills do that hasn't already been done? They focus on the people who historically have been discriminated against and who currently have the most difficulty voting. And I want to make it clear. I think 401 is a long bill. It's complicated. Some of the language might be a little bit difficult to understand. But what this bill is really doing is it's focused really on local governments. So local governments are our cities and townships and our counties. And it's looking at local governments and it's saying, what can citizens do if the local governments are making it difficult for them to vote? If the local governments are diluting their votes or suppressing their votes? And that bill gives them tools to be able to protect their votes. It gives them the right to litigate, to bring lawsuits, which they can do under the Federal Voting Rights Act. But as everyone has said, their rights under the Federal Voting Rights Act have been severely weakened by the federal courts. And these state voting rights acts have filled that gap. So that's what we're trying to do here. And one of the things that isn't part of the Federal Voting Rights Act, that is part of the Michigan Voting Rights Act, is the ability to avoid litigation. So we've got a process in here where you've got to sit down with the municipality or the county or whatever it is in advance of litigation and try to work it out. And I think that's a really important part of the bill because let's face it, litigation is difficult and litigation is expensive. And we don't really want our local governments to go through that if there's any way that they can possibly avoid it. So I think that's a very important part of these bills that hasn't been mentioned before, and that's not part of the federal VRA. But what the bill also does is it would allow voters of color in Michigan, for example, to challenge discriminatory maps. We still do have discriminatory maps at the local level, the ones that aren't covered by our independent redistricting commission, and to challenge rules and policies that result in discriminatory voter suppression. And these bills also include critical protections for disabled voters. You'll be hearing some more detailed testimony later, but there's a provision in Senate Bill 401 that allows for a disability monitor if there have already been violations. The disability monitor could be appointed by a court to protect against future violations, which could be very, very critical for our disabled voters. And the curbside voting, which we have already talked about, which codifies the provisions that already exist as guidelines in our election officials manual, and which have already been in practice across our state. And there are also important provisions that would provide for notice that would allow the public to be aware of key voting changes. One of the things about our election system, because it is so decentralized, is the public really doesn't hear about a lot of things that happen. And yes, you can FOIA local governments, but that is very time-consuming and very, very expensive if you're going to start doing FOIA requests of 1,520 local clerks. So having notice of key voting changes being required would be a very important transparency measure that is part of these bills. There's the Data Institute, which would centralize election data in one publicly available place, publicly available at no cost.
Ms. Pearsman, I hate to interrupt, but I think if you could just
Sure.
wrap it up. Sorry, we have so many people who want to speak today.
And I want to say one thing about Senate Bill 403 and the language access. The way I read that bill, the cost is on the Secretary of State. That was something that was negotiated at great length. We talked about that for months, and as it was originally drafted, the cost was to be borne by the local governments, and then it was shifted to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State bears the responsibility for translating the ballots, the applications, the other materials, and there's only a very small number of election materials that are required to be translated and distributed to the local governments in the bill. The rest of them would be designated by the Language Advisory Council, but all of them would have to be translated by the Secretary of State. So I'm a little confused by the concern about the costs. I believe that there's a catch-all provision in here that says that the Secretary of State bears the cost for all of that translation, including the live interpreter, if there is one, or the remote telephone system that is the alternative to that.
Thank you. Do we have questions? Representative DeBoyer.
Just really quick, it's something we really haven't talked about a lot, but you just touched on it. And perhaps the Michigan Department of State could interject on this. Has anybody in totality on all of these bills put together what the operational cost for this will be? And do you believe that it's going to be completely be able to be funded within your current budget in the Secretary of State's office? Because we're clearly imposing a tremendous amount of costs here. Do you guys even have a projection of what this is going to cost?
I think that's more a question for Mr. Adevby. And actually, why don't we have Mr. Adevby come back up, but after the next, I have two more people who had signed up ahead of time to speak. So why don't we have them speak briefly? And then that is a good question, Representative Boyer. We will have Mr. Adevby come back to address that. And because I think the Secretary of State's office is the best one to address some of the answers for these questions. Thank you, Ms. Peresman and Ms. Kovac.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's have testimony from Demetria McCain from the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, as well as I'm going to mispronounce this, I apologize, Lata Knott from the Campaign Legal Center. And if we could keep it under 5 minutes, I apologize. We just want to make sure we get everybody in here. So welcome and thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and I will truncate my comments so you can get to the questions. So good morning, everyone. I'm Demetria McCain. I serve as the Director of Policy at the Legal Defense Fund, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which is America's premier legal organization fighting for racial justice. Been doing so since 1940. I will say that at the Legal Defense Fund, we actually work to advance and protect the voting rights of our multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, and we have championed state voting rights acts like the Michigan VRA across the country. And so the stakes could not be higher than they certainly are right now, folks. For years, federal courts have been chipping away, as you heard, at the protections of the Federal Voting Rights Act, okay? Now, this erosion will not likely disappear anytime soon. They will continue, and we will continue to see rulings by federal judges who oppose voting rights and disregard legal precedent. And we have no reason to expect that the incoming Congress will pass the federal John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act during the upcoming years. And so Michigan must act to pass the Voting Rights Act now. We've heard before that if Michigan does this, it will be making history. This will be the most significant civil rights law in many, many years. There are certainly issues that have been discussed by the previous witness or testifier, that there are issues here in Michigan. And Michiganders have approached us and asked for our support and help in this work. So I'm going to pass the mic, in the interest of time, on to Ms. Knott, who's with the Campaign Legal Center. She's here to speak, and we've coordinated that she will answer questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Chair Cernoglu and members of the committee. My name is Letha Knott, and I represent the Campaign Legal Center, a nonpartisan organization that defends and promotes voting rights. This act will safeguard and expand upon the protections of the Federal Voting Rights Act and make sure that all Michiganders have an equal opportunity to participate in elections, regardless of what happens on the federal level. I will be brief because, as my colleague said, I would like the representatives to have the opportunity to ask me any technical questions that they have on the bill. But passing this package of bills will ensure that voters of color, voters with disabilities, and voters whose first language is not English will not face discrimination or unnecessary barriers to making their voices heard in elections. It will prohibit local governments from implementing election rules that deny historically disenfranchised voters equal access to the ballot or dilute their voting power. And it will allow voters to challenge these discriminatory rules in court. It'll expand access to translated election materials to more voters with limited English proficiency than what's required by the Federal Voting Rights Act, including voters who speak Arabic and African languages. And it will protect access to curbside voting so that voters with disabilities can vote safely. It also, as previous testifiers have said, contains provisions that encourage voters and local governments to work together to remedy potential violations before resorting to expensive litigation. This is in recognition of the fact that many local governments are not bad actors. They are, in fact, good actors that will want to fix problems when they become aware of them. Racial discrimination in voting can be the result of structures that have been in place long before local officials took office, and this bill recognizes that and actually encourages coordination between parties. We urge you to support this act, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that the committee has about how these bills work to advance democracy.
Thank you so much. I think we're probably all going to hold our questions to the end at this point, but if you're able to stick around, we may have some for you at this time. Thank you both.
Thank you very much. And I could not underscore enough the point that was made about the fact that there are lots of tools in this act. There are lots of tools, which includes the tools of there not necessarily being a need to jump to litigation, which is a huge savings for everyone. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We will now have testimony from Rima Marui. I apologize if I mispronounced that, who is the director for the National Network for Arab American Communities for the nonprofit Access. Welcome, and if you could also keep it to less than 5 minutes, that would be very much appreciated.
No problem. I will shorten, and you said my last name perfectly.
Wonderful.
Chair Sernoglu, Vice Chair Wigela, and Schmidt, and members of the Committee on Elections, thank you for allowing me to provide testimony on the Michigan Voting Rights Act, Senate Bills 401 to 404. My name is Rima Merwe. I am the director of the National Network for Arab American Communities, which is one of Access's national institutions. For more than 50 years, Access, the nation's largest Arab American community-based nonprofit, has built institutions that work to support families to come out of poverty by providing tools and services to meet their needs. Access supports families across communities by meeting their needs and removing barriers so they can thrive. We ensure immigrants are fully engaged citizens, supporting our mission to advance justice and equity. In our election work, we ensure Arab Americans and immigrants and more broadly, are registered to vote and have fair access to the polls. For every election, we have multiple poll challengers and poll watchers to ensure we can address barriers to voting. On March 28th this year, the federal government formally recognized Middle Eastern or North African communities as part of the Office of Management's budget's changes to Statistical Policy Directive 15, expanding the federal standards for data collection on race and ethnicity. This recognition gives visibility to our community that has been a part of the tapestry of this country for hundreds of years. Michigan's diverse communities contribute to its economic prosperity, rich culture, and diversity. However, not all communities are protected by the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965. In particular, Arab Americans and more broadly Middle Eastern or North African communities are not explicitly protected. By being categorized as white, Arab Americans have lacked political representation, our community's needs invisible in the redistricting process, and have lacked language access, such as in-language election materials and ballots. For instance, the lack of language assistance at the polls has led to Middle Eastern or North African communities being unable to fully participate in their local and state elections and therefore lack representations, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that. The lack of translated materials and ballots can be discouraging for limited English language speaking voters, adversely impacting their participation in the voting process. SB 403 will specifically address language access barriers by implementing a Language Access Advisory Council to ensure that all voters, regardless of their native language, have proper assistance in the election process. This council will provide adequate representation by promoting language inclusion across the state and prioritizing language accessibility for all Michiganders. The passage of Senate Bills 401 to 404 would not only mean having Middle Eastern or North African protections for our communities, but all minority and marginalized populations. Access strongly supports the creation and the implementation of a State Voting Rights Act. A state voting rights act would focus primarily on enhancing protections that prevent unfair and discriminatory voting practices among its marginalized communities. Among its marginalized citizens and prohibit voter denial, dilution, and suppression. Supporting the passage of a state voting rights act would address the unique demographic, historical, and political nuances of the state of Michigan. Thank you for allowing me to speak on this important issue.
Thank you so much. And if you're also available at the end, we may have some questions at that point. So thank you. We will now have testimony from Eric Welsby from Detroit Disability Power. Welcome, Mr. Welsby, and if you would also not mind being brief, we appreciate that. And welcome.
Yes, thank you so much. And I have some original comments. I will email them to the clerk afterwards. That way we can stick to what we need to. But thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I also want to give shout out to the municipal clerks who I've been bothering about accessibility throughout the year, and I've had the chance to speak to that group. And they really are working hard on accessibility. That being said, there's still a ways to go. 1 in 9 disabled voters report having an issue voting, some type of barrier, difficulty, and that's double the rate of other voters. So not an insignificant difference. So just by having a disability, the odds of you running into an issue are double anyone else. And these barriers come in a lot of forms. Sometimes, we're based in Detroit. We have a lot of old buildings that were built when there was no ADA, and historic churches that were part of the Underground Railroad. That we don't want to do major changes to. But it's great that those are voting locations. And so, figuring out how to make accessibility, how to make it work. Is a process. It's a task. It's partially on the clerk. It's also partially on other governmental bodies and private organizations whose buildings we use. And since many of these are community centers, it behooves not just for voting, but for the community to have these places be more accessible. But even in the new building that has great accessibility, we still run into access issues. Elevators break. Push buttons are sometimes for doors are sometimes a placebo. How often do you push them? Do you know if they actually work in all the buildings you go in and out of every day? You'd be shocked how often you push them and nothing happens. When these things happen, what is the plan? It is election day. A voter has showed up to vote and they cannot get to the voting space. Without something like curbside voting or drive-up voting or whatever terminology everyone is most comfortable with, how do we help this voter? How do we make sure they vote? How do we not send them on a journey across the city, going to the clerk's office or wherever, to a voting center to get their vote cast? That puts a really unreasonable burden, particularly on people that may have transportation barriers and other issues. Once somebody's at that polling location, if that's the polling location they're supposed to vote at, we need to be figuring out how to make sure they vote. I believe that curbside voting is the best way to do that. Many of our communities are already piloting it. They're running it under the guidance that currently exists. Making it required across the state, I think, would be, really, really helpful for disabled voters. It would help make it consistent, because also if someone goes to a community that currently is doing it and goes to some place that maybe isn't doing it or isn't advertising that they're doing it, they might think that there is no option for them. And again, in a new community, they might not know their polling location. They might not know until they show up that it's a problem. So, this is really, really impactful. And, this year, DDP was doing accessibility audits. We did 456 audits on polling locations. And I saw some things. Right, locations that, a church that had a chairlift to get down the stairs, that was the only way to get to the voting space. But what if you can't get into a chairlift? Now, Detroit does offer curbside, so it's not a problem there. But if they're a community that didn't, what does a voter do that can't use a chairlift to get up and down those stairs, to take their equipment with them while they use that chairlift? Temporary ramp setup, great idea, but some of them we saw were just on glance, not safe. If a voter said, I will not take my chair on that or walk up that because I don't feel safe, voters shouldn't feel unsafe going to vote. And so we really need to be aware of this. We need to do better.
Mr. Welsby, we do have one quick question from Representative Wigella.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks for testifying. were kind of touching on it. So I'm familiar with the audit that Detroit Disability Power did in 2022, where only I think 16% of the polling locations were fully accessible or had no barriers to voting. So you mentioned that you did one this year. Did you find similar numbers? And then kind of follow up to that is how do you see the Voting Rights Act kind of preventing those shortfalls moving forward?
Yeah, so we don't have all the data yet. It's a process. We actually, we audited this time. We extended to include early voting sites. And so, as well as doing, we did 261 in 2022. We did 456 audits. So it's going to take us a minute to go through, and we covered a broader area. We were mostly in Southeast Michigan. We actually have some audits out of like Saginaw, Bay City, Midland, Isabella County. So getting some more geographic diversity in the state. So we're getting that data pulled together, but many of the problems are still there. They haven't gone away, and and my thought is, or my expectation and what I saw in the preliminary data is, as we get to some more rural communities, we're going to see issues, but the issues are going to be different, right? I grew up in rural Michigan, right, Flushing Township, where when I was very young, our township hall, we didn't have a paved parking lot; it was gravel, right, which is an access issue. That's super common in a lot of townships, right? But if somebody uses some type of assistive mobility device, it is very easy for that to get stuck, snagged, them to fall, things like that. So I think we're going to see very similar data, but what the reason why the data will be similar will be very different causes. And as soon as we have that, we will certainly be sharing it very, very broadly. We're working with the Carter Center to get that data finalized.
Thank you so much. At this time, we're going to call Deb. Thank you for your testimony. And if you could stay after if people have more questions. But we're going to call Deputy Secretary Agogo Adevby, Mr. Adevby, just to kind of answer any final questions here. We have to move very quickly because we do have another committee in this room and we want to move forward. I know that we had a question from Representative DeBoyer, and then there seemed to be some unanswered questions based on some of our testimony from the clerks. So if you want to respond to that very quickly, that would be very much appreciated. And then if we have time, we can do more questions. And also apologies to those who were not able to speak today. We do see your cards, and they will all be on record, as well as people who submitted cards in support or opposition. And please feel free to submit written testimony to the committee. Thank you.
Right, so I just want to address the cost issue at first. We did do an analysis. Over the course of the summer, when we got the bills in relatively good form, I asked our Bureau of Elections to do a thorough analysis of the MVRA and all of its costs. So that analysis pointed out to us that there was a problem with the bill language that would have required every single precinct in the state to have a live interpreter, which is obviously cost prohibitive. So we asked for changes to the bill, which are included in the sub, to remove that requirement. The any election materials requirement that was under the previous version of the bill, obviously that would include all of our manuals to clerks. We found it to be 230 documents that need to be translated under that version of the bill. Too much. So now we've reduced it to ballots and 22 pages of voter-facing documents. 22 pages, sorry. Local costs. Those deal with notice requirements. So if I have it here, if a local government changes their method of election, if there's ever a ranked choice voting, if it ever happens, don't think it's going to happen, but if it did, if a community went from at-large districts to districts at a district level, you have to notify us. Or if the government there has a reorganization. Those are three pretty rare events, so it's not going to happen that often. But we had a cost in our analysis of having at least one full-time employee for every single city, township, and county jurisdiction. And then curbside. Curbside voting has been in our elections manual dating back to at least Ruth Johnson administration. It's currently a requirement for every single voting jurisdiction to provide curbside. That's always been in our manual. So we're just putting it in the statute. And I don't think that should be controversial, but it is, apparently. And then if you take all of those pieces out, when you take out the local costs, you take out the live translation, you essentially have about $15 million in terms of costs for MDOS. And of course, we'll be coming to you guys during appropriations if you pass this bill to ask for those costs to be covered.
Thank you. We have about 1 more minute. I don't know if you want to address anything that you heard earlier in the 1 remaining minute, and then we're going to move to the votes.
Yeah, I would just, in terms of the racial polarized voting, one thing I just want to point out is that in 2019, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that political gerrymandering is okay. So if a legislative body decides, well, all Democrats live here, and I just want to put them in a district, that is okay under law. So if you were to open this hole and amend this bill to allow evidence of political gerrymandering, you will essentially neutralize any ability to have racially polarized voting be proven under this bill, which is a current law under the federal VRA. So if you neutralize the federal VRA at the federal level through Supreme Court decisions, and you don't pass this bill as is, you will not have any protections. And let's remember this. When the VRA was passed in 1965, there were 2 black members of Congress, one from Harlem and one from Illinois. We now have 59 minority majority districts in this country, 14% of Congress. It's not that much. I think that's a good thing that this country does, and I think our local governments should reflect that as well. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary of State Agogo Adevby. Representative Churches makes a motion to report SB 401 with recommendation. Ms. Clerk, please call the vote.
Chair Sternglue?
Yes.
Representatives Wigella?
Yes.
Hope? Yes. Colzar?
Yes.
Burns?
Yes.
Churches?
Yes.
Smith?
No.
DeBoyer?
No.
Madam Chair, you have 6 yeas, 2 nays, motion passes.
Thank you. Representative Burns makes a motion to adopt the H2 substitute for SB 402. Ms. Clerk, please call the vote.
Chair Sternglue?
Yes.
Representatives Wigella?
Yes.
Hope? Yes. Colzar?
Yes.
Burns?
Yes.
Churches?
Yes.
Smith?
Pass. No, sorry.
DeBoyer?
No.
Madam Chair, you have 6 yeas, 2 nays, motion passes.
Thank you. Representative Colazar makes a motion to report SB 402 as amended as substituted with recommendation. Ms. Clerk, please call the vote.
Chair Sternglue?
Yes.
Representatives Wigella?
Yes.
Hope? Yes. Colzar?
Yes.
Burns?
Yes.
Churches?
Yes.
Smith?
No.
DeBoyer?
No.
Madam Chair, you have 6 yeas, 2 nays, motion passes.
Thank you. Representative Hope makes a motion to adopt the H1 substitute for SB 403. Ms. Clerk, please call the vote.
Chair Sternglue?
Yes.
Representatives Wigella?
Yes.
Hope? Yes. Colzar?
Yes.
Burns?
Yes.
Churches? Smith?
No.
DeBoyer?
No.
Madam Chair, you have 6 yeas, 2 nays, 0 pass, the motion passes.
Thank you. Representative Wigella makes a motion to report SB 403 as amended as substituted with recommendation. Ms. Clerk, please call the vote.
Chair Sternglue?
Yes.
Representatives Wigella?
Yes.
Hope? Yes. Colzar?
Yes.
Burns?
Yes.
Churches?
Yes.
Smith?
No.
DeBoyer?
Excuse me, no.
Madam Chair, you have 6 yeas, 2 nays, 0 pass, the motion passes.
Thank you. Representative Churches makes a motion to report SB 404 with recommendation. Ms. Clerk, please call the vote.
Chair Sternglue?
Yes.
Representatives Wigella?
Yes.
Hope? Yes. Colzar?
Yes.
Burns?
Yes.
Churches?
Yes.
Smith?
No.
DeBoyer?
No.
Madam Chair, you have 6 yeas, 2 nays, 0 pass, the motion passes.
Thank you so much. We will continue to work with all of you on your concerns. If you have any, and this is a very historic and important package. So thank you all for your time. We now have another committee coming in, so there being no further business before the committee will stand adjourned.